The story of Louis B. Chesty Puller begins long before the echoes of battle and the harsh clang of rifles. It begins in a world far removed from the deserts, jungles, and freezing hills where his legend would later be forged. Born in 1898 inches West Point, Virginia, Puller came into a family steeped in tradition, pride, and an unshakable sense of duty. The Pullers were known for their resilience, for their belief that honor was not something inherited, it was earned. From the earliest days of his childhood, young Louis was drawn to stories of courage, to tales of men who stood firm when the world seemed determined to sweep them away. There was something in the rhythm of those stories that called to him, that whispered he was meant for more than the ordinary life his small Virginia town could offer. Yet, he was not destined to follow a smooth path. Puller's youth was marked by hardship, struggle, and lessons in self-reliance. He learned early that life had a way of testing men, sometimes in ways that were unfair, often in ways that would break lesser souls. And perhaps it was that very crucible that shaped the steel of the man who would one day become Chesty Puller, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. People often imagine military legends as almost mythic figures, born fully formed into greatness. But Puller was not a myth. He was a man who fought tooth and nail for every step, every achievement, every inch of respect earned from those he commanded. In 1918, with the world still reeling from the Great War, Puller joined the United States Marine Corps. He was barely out of his teens, a young man standing at the threshold of a life that would demand more from him than he could have imagined. There was a fire in him, a restless spirit that refused to sit idle, and the Marines were where he found both purpose and a home. It was not the uniform that drew him, but the challenge, the opportunity to test himself against the fiercest adversities life could conjure. His early years in the Corps were marked by rigorous training, long deployments, and the relentless shaping of character that only the Marines could demand. Puller was not a man who shied away from hardship. He embraced it, often with a grin that unnerved both peers and superiors alike. His reputation began to grow slowly, quietly, but with unmistakable force. Those who served with him learned quickly that Puller had an unshakable code, a combination of discipline, loyalty, and toughness that set him apart. But Puller's story is not just a chronicle of military maneuvers or heroic battles. It is a tale of contradiction, of a man both feared and revered, one whose courage inspired devotion, but whose intensity could terrify even seasoned Marines. He had a presence that seemed larger than life, a voice that carried across fields and barracks, a gaze that measured men and found both weakness and potential. And yet, beneath the formidable exterior, there was a deeply human side, a man who mourned losses, who wrestled with the cost of war, who understood the fragility of life even as he demanded the utmost from those around him. By the time the world was once again plunged into global conflict in the 1940 seconds, Chesty Puller was no longer an unknown officer. He had honed his craft in the often overlooked theatres of military engagement, and his name began to appear in dispatches for daring operations that tested the limits of strategy and courage. From the sweltering jungles of Central America to the treacherous hills of China during the so-called Banana Wars, Puller carved out a reputation not just for bravery, but for brilliance in leadership. He was a tactician, yes, but also a man who led from the front, who shared the dangers of his men, and whose presence on the battlefield inspired confidence in the most desperate of circumstances. Yet, for all his accolades and growing fame, Puller remained deeply grounded. He was not a man motivated by medals or recognition, though history would eventually bestow upon him more honors than any Marine could have imagined. He measured success in loyalty, in the survival and well-being of his men, and in the integrity with which he carried himself through the chaos of war. His actions would later become the stuff of legend, small unit tactics that confounded enemies, daring raids under impossible odds, and an unyielding will that never allowed retreat when lives were at stake. But the Puller story is not just about heroism, it is about the forgotten truths behind the legend. What does it mean to be remembered as a war hero? How do we separate the man from the myth? Chesty Puller's life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. The cost of unwavering courage, the weight of command, and the personal sacrifices hidden behind the medals and battle stories. He was not perfect, nor was he untouchable. And yet, even in his imperfections, there lies a profound lesson about commitment, resilience, and the human capacity to rise in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we begin to peel back the layers of Puller's life, we will venture into the arenas where his legend was truly forged: the bitter cold of Korea, the relentless heat and mud of Guadalcanal, the ferocious jungles of the Pacific. We will explore the moments that defined him, the stories that are seldom told, and the truths that history sometimes leaves buried beneath the glow of heroism. This is a story not only of battle but of character, a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the surface and see the man who stood unflinching when the world demanded courage in its purest, harshest form. And so, we begin our journey into the forgotten history of Louis B. Chesty Puller, a man whose legend looms large, yet whose story is far richer, far more complex, and far more human than most of us realize. The battlefield awaits, the stories are ready to be told, and the truth about the Marine Corps' most celebrated warrior is about to be revealed in all its raw, unvarnished reality. The legend of Chesty Puller did not emerge in the comfort of barracks or on polished parade grounds. It was carved in the mud, blood, and fire of some of the most brutal conflicts the 20th century had to offer. Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Korea. Names that would become etched in military history. But for Puller, each was more than a strategic location. They were proving grounds, stages where leadership and courage were measured not by strategy manuals, but by the lives of the men who followed him. Guadalcanal in 1942 was Puller's first real taste of war in the global theatre. The island was a cauldron of chaos, thick jungle, malaria, and the constant, unnerving presence of a determined enemy. Marines were pushed to their limits, facing conditions that would break most men. But Puller thrived in this environment. His approach was simple, yet profound. Lead from the front, share every danger, and inspire confidence through action, not words. He was not content to issue orders from a distance. He moved through the jungle with his men, rifle in hand, assessing the battlefield, sensing the tension, and making split-second decisions that often meant the difference between life and death. Stories from Guadalcanal capture a man who seemed unstoppable, a leader whose reputation grew with every daring action. There was the night when his unit was pinned down by enemy fire, outnumbered and surrounded. Where many would have ordered retreat, Puller moved among his men, calm and resolute, orchestrating a counterattack that not only broke the enemy's hold, but saved countless lives. His men remember it not just as a victory, but as a demonstration of unshakable courage and presence. Chesty Puller was not just leading them, he was with them in every moment of danger. And then came Peleliu, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. The island was a furnace of heat and brutality, and the Japanese defenders were relentless. Casualties mounted, and the terrain seemed to conspire against the Marines at every turn. Here again, Puller's leadership shone. He was relentless in his attention to detail, ensuring his units were positioned effectively. Morale remained high, and no soldier was left behind. He understood the psychology of combat as much as the tactics. Fear was the enemy's ally, and he refused to let it take hold among his men. Tales of Puller moving across battlefields under enemy fire, coordinating attacks, and personally rescuing injured Marines became the stuff of legend. But beneath the legend, there was strategy, intelligence, and a calculated understanding of warfare that separated him from mere bravery. It is often forgotten that Puller's genius was not in raw heroics alone, but in his understanding of human endurance and resilience. He pushed his men, yes, but he also protected them in ways that only the most experienced leaders understand. He knew when to advance, when to hold, when to conserve energy, and when to strike with unrelenting force. These decisions saved lives, won battles, and built a devotion among his troops that was rarely seen in the chaos of war. Marines would speak of his intensity, his fiery temper, but also of his unwavering fairness, his respect for courage, and the deep bond he forged with those who followed him into hell and back. Puller's time in the Korean War would cement his reputation beyond the Pacific. The terrain, the climate, and the enemy were entirely different, but his principles remained unchanged. At Chosin Reservoir, a name that still chills Marines decades later, Puller's leadership was tested in ways that few can imagine. Facing freezing temperatures, mountainous terrain, and an enemy that vastly outnumbered his forces. Puller led his Marines in defensive operations that became textbook examples of discipline under pressure. His orders were precise, his courage infectious, and his ability to maintain morale in the face of near-impossible odds became the stuff of legend. There were countless small actions, overlooked in the larger sweep of history, that reveal the full measure of Puller's character. Accounts tell of him walking the front lines in snow and ice, sharing what little food he had with his men, calming panicked troops, and improvising strategies in the moment when plans collapsed. These were not staged heroics, they were life-and-death decisions made under the harshest conditions imaginable, and they were repeated time and again, in different theatres, under different circumstances, proving that Puller's skill was not circumstantial but inherent. Yet, despite all of this, Chesty Puller remained remarkably humble about his own legacy. He did not crave recognition or accolades, though history would eventually shower them upon him. Puller cared about the men beside him, the principles of the corps, and the duty that bound him to both. He understood the weight of command, the silent cost of every order given, and the invisible scars carried by every soldier who fought alongside him. This is a side of Puller that is too often overshadowed by tales of daring raids and enemy engagements, a man who felt deeply, who mourned losses, and who carried the burden of leadership with a solemnity that only true veterans can understand. Some fascinating and lesser-known facts about Puller reveal dimensions of his life beyond the battlefield. For instance, he was known to have a sharp wit and a love of storytelling, often regaling new recruits with tales that were as instructive as they were entertaining. He had a meticulous attention to detail, whether inspecting a unit or planning a campaign, and he had an uncanny ability to read people, understanding instinctively who could handle stress and who might falter under fire. Puller's personal letters, rarely shared publicly, reflect a man who thought constantly about duty, honor, and the enduring bonds between comrades. Another overlooked aspect of Puller's life was his adaptability. He fought in vastly different climates and conditions, from tropical jungles to frozen mountains, and yet he consistently adjusted tactics to meet the challenges at hand. Few could have thrived under such varying circumstances, and even fewer could inspire confidence in their men across such extremes. His legacy, then, is not only one of bravery, but of leadership that transcended circumstance, time, and place. As we explore these stories, it becomes clear that Chesty Puller was more than just a decorated Marine. He was a study in human endurance, resilience, and leadership. He embodied principles that are timeless: courage under fire, unwavering commitment to those under his command, and the ability to act decisively when the world seems bent on chaos. But even in his legend, there is nuance, complexity, and forgotten history truths that reveal the full scope of the man behind the medals. And now, as the battles rage on in memory and in the retelling of history, we are drawn to the moments that define Puller most. Not the headlines or the citations, but the human moments, the fear, the doubt, the camaraderie, and the resolve. These are the pieces that complete the puzzle of Chesty Puller, the man who would endure the unendurable and emerge as one of the most remarkable figures in military history. The stage is set for the final chapters, where his courage is tested against the harshest realities, where the line between legend and human frailty blurs, and where the truth about Chesty Puller can finally be seen in its entirety. The battles he fought, the men he led, and the sacrifices he endured all converge toward a climax that is as awe-inspiring as it is deeply human. The final chapters of Chesty Puller's story are not told in parades or ceremonies, but in the crucible of combat and the quiet moments afterward, where courage is tested not for glory, but for survival, for honor, for the men who trust you with their lives. Korea, particularly the Chosin Reservoir campaign, became the stage upon which Puller's legacy would reach its zenith. The bitter cold of the mountains was more than a physical challenge, it was a psychological war. Frostbite claimed limbs, snow collapsed underfoot, and the enemy pressed relentlessly. Supplies were scarce, morale was tested, and the line between life and death became terrifyingly thin. Yet Puller's presence was like a beacon. He moved among his men, his eyes scanning, calculating, commanding with a clarity that cut through the chaos. In the midst of encirclement and overwhelming odds, he orchestrated a fighting withdrawal, maintaining cohesion, and ensuring that not a man was left behind. It was a masterclass in leadership under conditions so extreme that most would crumble under pressure. Puller's actions at Chosin were not reckless heroics, they were the culmination of decades of experience, intuition, and an unshakable moral compass. He knew that the true measure of a leader is not the victories won, but the lives preserved. Under his command, the Marines fought with discipline, bravery, and a cohesion that was almost instinctual. Stories from the survivors recount him standing atop icy ridges, directing movements, offering encouragement, and taking bullets that might have been spared for others. In those moments, legend and humanity converged, revealing a man whose courage was inseparable from his care for those he led. Yet, Puller's greatness was not solely forged on the battlefield. Off the front lines, he confronted the personal costs of war, the losses, the injuries, the emotional toll. He wrote letters, he spoke privately to comrades, he reflected on the gravity of command. There was a weight in Puller, a constant reckoning with the human cost of the choices he made. Unlike many celebrated heroes, he did not wear his reputation as armor. It was a responsibility, a mantle he bore quietly and solemnly. Even after the guns fell silent, Puller's influence continued to shape the Marine Corps. He trained a generation of leaders who carried forward his principles. Lead from the front, honor your men, never compromise integrity, and meet adversity with relentless resolve. His speeches, his guidance, and even his casual conversations were lessons in resilience, decisiveness, and the unspoken power of example. In every anecdote shared by Marines who served under him, there is an unmistakable thread. Puller inspired more through action than words, more through presence than titles, and more through courage than ceremony. There are moments in history where a person transcends the circumstances around them, and Chesty Puller was such a man. Yet, there is a forgotten layer to his story that makes it even more compelling, the human side of the legend. He struggled with loss, with the fear of failure, with the knowledge that no matter how many victories he won, the consequences of war were often beyond control. In this, Puller was relatable, profoundly human, and perhaps more inspiring. He shows us that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, not the absence of doubt, but the resolve to act despite it. By the time of his retirement in 1955, Puller had become a symbol, an icon of bravery and leadership whose name would resonate for generations. Yet even as his medals, citations, and public recognition accumulated, he remained grounded in the core values that had guided him from the start: loyalty, discipline, courage, and care for his men. He understood that the story history would remember was only a fragment. The true legacy lived in the lives he protected, the Marines he inspired, and the ethical code he embodied. Chesty Puller passed away in 1971, leaving behind a legacy that is often misunderstood or simplified into myth. But the forgotten history, the complexity, the human struggles, the quiet, uncelebrated acts of heroism reveals a deeper truth. Puller was not infallible. He was a man tested by the harshest realities imaginable, a man whose greatness came from enduring those tests and bringing others through them. His story challenges us to reconsider what it means to be a hero, to lead, and to live with courage and conviction. Even today, his legend lives on in every Marine who recalls the stories of his bravery, in every battlefield study that dissects his tactics, and in every lesson of leadership that bears his imprint. Chesty Puller reminds us that true heroism is not about fame or recognition, it is about steadfastness in adversity, integrity in command, and the enduring commitment to protect and inspire those who depend on you. As we close this chapter on Louis B. Chesty Puller, we are left not just with medals or battle reports, but with a portrait of a man whose life was defined by courage, responsibility, and humanity. He faced the unimaginable, bore the weight of command, and emerged as a symbol of the finest qualities the human spirit can achieve. And while history may simplify legends into stories of triumph, the truth of Chesty Puller is far richer, far more profound, and far more human than most will ever know. In the end, the forgotten history of Chesty Puller is not just the story of a Marine, it is a story of resilience, of leadership, of sacrifice, and of the enduring power of character in the face of relentless adversity. And as we remember him, we are reminded that the measure of a hero is not in the medals they wear, but in the lives they touch, the courage they inspire, and the legacy they leave for those who follow.